You're listening to Walk It Out with Tricia Goyer, where we discover what it looks like to follow God and be swept away on the journey of a lifetime. Author of over 70 books, mom of 10, yes, 10, homeschooler and speaker, Tricia Goyer will explore what radical obedience to God's word looks like. It's time to hear from God lovers who've dared to say yes. Listen in to heart chats and learn how others overcame doubts and fears. Discover how God used ordinary people to impact others one step at a time. If you're ready to get radical, get going, and make a difference in this world, you're at the right place. Here's your host, prolific writer, world traveler, people lover, and mega nap taker, Tricia Goyer.
Well, I have a super fun guest today. So I am thinking back to probably 15 years ago. I lived in Montana at the time, and there was a singer coming to our church named Matthew West. And so I looked at my husband. I'm like, I don't know. They have someone coming in. I've never heard of him before. Do you want to go hear this Matthew West guy? And my husband, John, said, yes, let's go. And I have fallen in love with his music and his ministry over the years. So I'm sure you don't need much of an intro, but Matthew West is a Grammy nominated AMA Dove Award winning artist. He's written 5 books today, and he has a new podcast, which we'll all be talking about today. The podcast, the music, nonprofit ministry, all the things. So welcome, Matthew.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And, saying that I've written 5 books, like coming from somebody who's written 80 books, I feel a little foolish with that introduction, but
well, I don't sing at all. Like, I sing to my granddaughter. My daughter's a
Yeah.
missionary in the Czech Republic, and my little
wow.
1-year-old. So this morning I was singing ABC and Old MacDonald. Like, that's my level of music
Do
ability.
they tell you to stop or?
No. My granddaughter, she speaks Czech and English, and so I'm always
Wow.
like, does she want me to say more? Because she'll say something in Czech, and my daughter's like, yes, you want you to sing some more. So at least my 1.5-year-old
Yeah.
granddaughter likes my singing.
Well, all I speak is English, and then I'm pretty fluent in Pig Latin. And that's
okay.
So I don't know if that counts as bilingual, but
Okay, Pig Latin. I was showing my kids the other day. I'm like, do to goo, you to goo, no to go. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, okay, in the 80s, that was the thing.
That was the thing, man. I couldn't pass my Spanish class, but Pig Latin was a breeze for me. So it's great to talk to you today. I was stalking you on your website prior to our interview. I'm joking, obviously, but I was on your website. Your listeners are like, oh, he's creepy. But I couldn't help but notice that the vast majority of your podcast guests have been ladies, and so thank you for bringing a dude to your show.
Absolutely. Well, I once in a while I'll let some guys in. So.
I'm glad to be here.
Oh, I'm glad that you're here. I love all you're doing. And the other day it was so funny because as I'm cooking, because every night, it takes a couple hours to cook for this huge family. I'll say, Alexa, play Lauren Daigle, or So the other day I'm like, Alexa, play Matthew West. And as I was listening to the songs, just story after story, and thinking about my own life and things I've experienced. I mean, you are such a storyteller. So even though, I won't say only 5 books, because 5 books is a lot, but you are writing stories in your music with every song that you write. And so there's so much storytelling. I would just love to hear, like, how did that aspect come out, whether it's in your music and your podcast, which I do want to talk about. Why is it so important to you to share these stories?
Well, first of all, the 2 things you just described, show me how different you and I are, because one, we've been having food delivered and not cooking quite as much. And number 2, my kids are forbidden to say, Alexa, play Lauren Daigle. They're only allowed to say play Matthew West. So that's a strict rule in our house. They didn't even know that, like, Toby Mac existed for years, because I'm just kidding. But and really, me starting to write books was a result of the storytelling that I've done through the years with my music. There would be just different songs, messages, or stories that inspired the songs where I just felt like, man, there's so much more to unpack that just can't be really discovered in the confines of a 3-minute song. And so, my dad's a preacher, and I kind of think of, like, writing books and preaching a sermon and writing a song. They're all kind of like, they're in their own lane, but they're they're somewhat connected. There's some similarities there, and with them, each comes with a different set of like freedoms from a creative expression standpoint, and a different set of limitations or boundaries, if you will. And so the freedoms that I get in music are many, but the limitations sometimes in terms of communicating a story and having to make sure it rhymes and all of those things, have really helped me to hone my skills as a storyteller, to be able to say more with less. And yet there's been several occasions where the stories that have just moved me so deeply to write a song where I'm like, man, I want to unpack that on a deeper level and take people on a devotional or inspirational journey beyond the 3-minute song, which is what's led me to do, whether it's writing a book or a podcast or things like that, just the chances to communicate beyond that 3-minute song, while always knowing that my true like first creative love is what happens when I pick up a guitar.
Yeah, and I love that you're just expanding on the storytelling that you're already doing in your music. And I think that's what we appreciate, because there are so many stories. I tell my husband, after writing 80 books, of course, I'm like, you could take me to any town and I could go to the grocery store and walk up to someone and they would have a story that would be worthy of a book. And so a lot of my novels are inspired by World War II veterans. I've interviewed hundreds of veterans, and I've written Amish novels. I've interviewed couples that lost families in horse and buggy accidents. I mean, there's so many stories out there. And I think as communicators, when we can open up and share either our story or someone else's story, that's where the connection is made. Like when I was listening to your music as I'm cooking up spaghetti, like this huge pot of spaghetti for my family, I'm thinking of times in my life, my name is, where I felt that shame or guilt. I mean, all those things. And it's connecting on a human level with real people by sharing a piece of us, and it's like we're going first and giving them the opportunity to open their hearts up.
It really is. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. There's something about engaging with someone's story that helps you engage with your own. I think it's almost like this. I remember like in recent years, there's been this Me Too movement. You know what I mean? For we really all want to be able to say that. I mean, I think a lot of times we tend to feel like, I've met so many people, in short, that have made me feel like, or have communicated to me that they've been made to feel like their story doesn't matter, their story's insignificant, their story's boring, or even, to greater extremes, like their story's disqualified because it's too messed up or too messy, or the chapters that they've been handed from a rough childhood or dysfunctional family have made them feel like the best of their stories behind them. And that's really my heartbeat in the songs that I write. And in any opportunity I get to communicate is to be highly aware of the fact that I might be speaking to somebody who is at the most defeated point in their story. And they need to be reminded that defeat doesn't have to be the defining chapter. That there are chapters to come. And I think that's why throughout scripture, there's so many reminders that God's doing a new thing, that he makes all things new, that he knows the plans he has for us. God is looking ahead. He sees the full story, the chapters that have yet to be written. And the enemy wants us to stay in those defeated chapters. And so, but when you engage with somebody else's story, I remember as a young kid, we used to have this drug recovery program come to my church. My dad's a pastor. And I think it's like every few months, this group from the inner city of Chicago, as part of their recovery journey, they would travel to our church, and they would get up and they would form this sort of motley crew of a choir, and they would sing a worship song. And I remember it always sounded terrible, but they were like just giving it all they had. Like they were singing so loud and out of tune, and they were worshiping Jesus, the likes, of which I wouldn't normally see on a Sunday morning in the suburbs. But then one by one, they would take the microphone and different guys would share their testimony. And I remember as a kid, just on the edge of my seat, like moved by the authenticity of what was taking place on the stage. Somebody that wasn't kind of sweeping the ugly parts of their story under the rug, but in fact, they were standing up and leading with that. Kind of like you would see at a recovery group, at an AA meeting. I've read one of my favorite authors, Philip Yancey, wrote a book called What's So Amazing About Grace.
Oh, yeah.
Talking about how the church should be more like an AA meeting, because at an AA meeting, it begins with an admission of guilt.
Yes.
And then there's no shame, And so there's something about that I've always been drawn to, and yet I've always been at war internally with that, because so much of my life is in the public spotlight. And so there's always this feeling of like, well, I need to kind of put on a show or put on a face. And I think we're moved when we see a display of authenticity that is somebody sharing their story. And I think that's what moves me to write songs. And ultimately, what I hope to accomplish when people hear my music or read a book, that they tap into their own story and the power that they may be surprised to find that it still holds when God is, given the pen and allowed to be the true author of our story.
And I think the cool thing is, when we, take the time to write music, which I don't do, write books, write our stories down, that God will use that in times we never even realize. I've gotten letters from people that just in the moment they needed hope. They found one of my books, and I know I was talking to my kids last night. I'm like, hey, I'm going to be talking to Matthew West. It's always fun, like, to tell them who I'm going to be interviewing the next day. And one of my daughters, who we adopted when she was 13, she's 17, foster care most of her life. She also has an autoimmune disease. Just, rough stories of being in the hospital alone. Because the children's home where she was at, they just dropped her there at the hospital. Just hard
Wow.
stuff.
Yeah.
And she goes, "Oh my goodness, I love the song Strong Enough. That's my favorite, Matthew." And I'm thinking, here's this little girl for so many years, didn't even know she's gonna have a family. We adopted her and her 3 sisters, so there's 4 of them total. And alone in the hospital, and here's Strong Enough, as she listens to it. And all these years, she's 17 now. She's a junior in college. She's in a family, but during those hard times, I wasn't there. I wasn't able to be there. I didn't even know she'd later be part of our family. But like, she's listening to your song Strong Enough and feeling like, I can make it through this. So that is just an amazing thing that God does.
Well, that touches me. That touches my heart. I'm always so humbled when I hear something like that, and it fires me up. And I love what you said. It's like we might be surprised by, which chapters of our stories God will use, and we'll be constantly amazed when we make ourselves available to see which moments, he wants to use our stories in somebody else's life, and the way that he can connect us in that, through our own struggles. The way that we can be an encouragement to somebody else in the middle of their struggle is a really powerful thing. So I love that. And I love the community that gets formed in that. Don't you? It's like, it's like that Me Too. It's that, wait a minute. Okay, I see. Like John, in the book of John, 10:10, John 10:10, Jesus lays out Satan's 3-point plan for us. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. That's the 3-point plan. And I think of that when I think of how Satan has tried to work in my own life, where he doesn't just want me to get tripped up. He doesn't want to just trip me up. He wants to trip me up and then knock me down. And then he doesn't just want to knock me down. He wants to keep me down. Steal, kill, destroy. Like in those 3 phases. And the way that he keeps us down is to make us feel like not only are you messed up, but you're the only one who's messed up that way. And I think, man, the shame that comes from that, and shame leads, as we all know, shame will lead us to isolation. And isolation is the opposite of what we need. What we need is community. What we need is accountability. What we need is support. And too many times I've allowed myself to become more isolated as opposed to finding community. And then when somebody shares their story and I go, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. Little by little, we take a step out of those shadows and we begin to find the freedom that comes when we stop believing the enemy's lies that led us to that isolation in the beginning.
Yeah, so good. And it reminds me of some lyrics that someone wrote. This is something like, lie number 2, everybody's life is perfect except yours. And that talks about, I love Truth Be Told, the lyrics there. It's exactly what we're talking about. That's
what I'm living right now too. That's an autobiography, if there ever was one, a song, Truth Be Told. And I was actually surprised that, like, I wrote that song, and it was one of those songs where I was like, that song, I am so proud of that song, because it, like, if there was ever an honest depiction of some of the struggles in my life, that song's it. But I'm so glad I wrote it. I know it'll never be on the radio because it's just too raw.
Oh my gosh, it's so good though.
Well, sure enough, then my record label's like, yep, that's the one we're gonna put out.
Yeah,
like,
it's
what?
so good. Yeah.
So nothing like feeling like now you put a song out there and the whole world is reading your mail. You know what I mean? And so, but it's all in the hope that somebody else goes, oh man, I've believed that lie too. I feel like I'm trying to keep up a highlight reel and I don't want to do that anymore, So that's been a big part of my story. Like I talk about it. I talk about like being a professional Christian, which is, my definition of that is somebody who has to live out their personal faith in Christ constantly in a public platform. So that was me as a preacher's kid. I always felt this pressure to be perfect. And then, fast forward, now I got a microphone in my face half of my life or more than half of my life. And I'm on stage and I'm singing for people. And, I think there's a tendency to be good at being a Christian and checking the right boxes and quoting the right scriptures and saying the right things so that everybody, thinks you're good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're fine. Just like that song says. And, I guess these days I feel like I'm on a personal mission to find a more authentic version of myself.
And I think I hear that so much because we get tired of ourselves. We get tired of I know I get tired of myself. Like, why do I keep doing the same things? And why do I keep struggling? But when we could talk about it, you sing about it, when we could share about it, then when, like you said, community, other people come around and say, me too. And my husband always says, we don't have skeletons in the closet because I display them on the front lawn.
Yeah,
through
that's
my,
awesome.
My writing, we've had marriage struggles that's been in books. And I had an abortion when I was 15 that I've written about and spoken about. And but when we're able to share our stories and other people can find hope in that and can turn to God for healing and can realize okay, I'm not the only one. And God can be there in the struggles. It makes all the difference and it helps people.
You're so right. And I love that comment about the skeletons. I was at a conference. I was actually at a women's conference, which I believe has prepared me for this podcast interview. No, I'm just kidding. But I was speaking at this women's conference and I was talking about what we're talking about, basically. Like I was just saying, hey, I've been writing these. Basically what happened is I started to invite people to share their story with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to decide, all right, instead of writing songs, like I was getting to the point where I was like, okay, I think I know how to write a song. I think I actually know how to write a hit song. I just put in my 10,000 hours, but I don't want to hit cruise control and rest on my abilities that I've developed. I want to be challenged. I want to be surprised. And so I thought, all right, instead of making my next record, I'm going to tell people I'm going to ask people to tell me what I should write about.
Mm-hmm.
So thousands of people started sending their testimonies in, and it was a powerful exercise. I thought it was a creative experiment, and it wound up being a life-changing journey. But at a conference, I started talking about, hey, there's power in your story, but some of you have some chapters of your story that you've refused to believe that, one, that God could heal that chapter, and two, that he could actually shine through that chapter. And this woman named Jenny went home from that conference, and Jenny from Austin, Texas, and she wrote a letter to me, and I read it. She's like, I heard you at this conference, and I knew that the Lord was speaking to me that it's time to talk about a certain chapter of my story. And she said, 35 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. I got pregnant. My boyfriend didn't love me. I didn't love my boyfriend. I knew my church was going to judge me. I knew my parents were going to be so upset, and I didn't want to bring shame to my family. So I terminated a pregnancy. And she said, all these years later, she'd been married for 25 years. She never even told her husband. And she's like, I know God's forgiven me. It's just been so hard for me to forgive myself. And so I wound up sitting at this piano in a cabin where I was staying, and I wrote this song for Jenny, and it's called The Healing Has Begun. And it says, you have carried the weight of your secret for way too long, thinking if there's a place called forgiveness, you don't belong. But freedom can never be found behind those walls, so just let them fall. And I wrote this song, and I called Jenny, and I said, hey, do you know who I am? And she said, yeah. I said, do you remember writing your story to me? She said, yeah. I said, well, I wrote you a song. And she just got real quiet. And I said, I just have to ask you, why, of all people, would you set a 35-year-old secret free to me? And she said, well, I never thought you'd actually read it. She just figured, oh, he's some singer. He's never going to get to my story. And then she started crying. She's like, but I'm so glad you did, because, that secret's a heavy thing to carry. And now I think some healing is going to begin in my life. And after that phone call, she had a talk with her husband and started getting into some counseling just to really just break down some of those walls. And then she goes on and begins telling her story and working at the local crisis pregnancy center and just seeing God shine through that in a really powerful way. But that's just one example of how, I've seen that somebody sharing their story really opens the door. It unlocks it and allows, true healing to take place for some of the most wounded chapters of our stories.
Absolutely. I remember going into a post-abortion Bible study about 5 years after my abortion. Our church was having one. No one knew. I did tell my husband before we got married. But friends didn't know, Bible study people, church people didn't know. And walking in there and seeing other women that were hurting and broken and telling my story, I felt this weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized had been there for so long. And a couple of the women and I helped start a crisis pregnancy center there in Montana when I lived there, that's still going strong, that all these lives are touched. And it's the enemy wants to keep us silent. He wants to keep us bound. He wants that burden to stay on us. And when we can share our stories, and even I love that, Jenny, writing a letter to you, like God did freedom there, but then knowing that that's a song now and other people are going to be ministered. I'm so thankful for that healing journey that letter she wrote has
Isn't that
given her.
awesome?
Yeah, I love it.
It's so cool. And when you get a taste of what it's like to be sort of a conduit or a connector to that type of healing in someone's life, because sometimes people will say, and if I was all wrapped up in my pride or in my feelings, I would really take it personal when someone's like, that song changed my life. But because I know where my strength comes from, because I know who's alive in me, like I know what that person really means is God changed my life and he got my attention through a little 3-minute song. And I just think once you get a taste of having that type of opportunity to connect with people, you want more of that. And it's just a really special thing. And here's the best part. You don't have to be a singer or a podcast host or an author of 80 books to encourage people to tell their story or to be a character in somebody else's story, because that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
What we're talking about is, hey, can you take your eyes off of your own thing long enough to realize that somebody around you has been put in your path for a reason? Or are you so wrapped up in your own circumstances that you fail to ever even have the capacity to be a character in somebody else's story and see how God might want to use you? I was listening to a pastor on a podcast this morning. He was telling the story of Jonah, and it's like, think about that. Like, Jonah had a moment where he refused to be a character in the story of the people of Nineveh. Like, God called him and he's like, nope, I want to do my thing. Even if I want God to use me, I'm going to decide how, right? I'm going to decide how. So he runs and goes the other way. Of course, we know, God was basically saying, you can run, but you can't hide. And I think about that. I just wonder how many of us, we run away from our Nineveh. How many of us decide, you know what, God, that part of my story, I know you may want to use it, but I can't bear how that's going to make me feel or whatever it may be. So I do think hopefully somebody listening right now is feeling challenged to go, all right, like maybe there's a Nineveh that God's calling me to, that I've been like afraid to go there with my story or afraid to become a character in somebody else's story. But man, that's what it is. That's when life gets good. Right. And not only that, but that's when we begin to take on a whole new perspective for our own problems. When we focus on somebody else's needs and problems, God gives us new eyes to see what we're going through.
And it really is, it's redeeming those points in our lives. If someone would have told me right after my abortion that I'd be talking about it on a podcast or speaking at a conference, there's no way, because it had bound me so much. But then God's able to redeem that when we share it, when we share his goodness and we share forgiveness and see other people. And it's being part of God's redemptive process in the lives of other people as we share our hard stuff. And it is hard. The first step is the hardest for sure, like just sharing it with one person.
Sure.
But God can do so much with it. And I just love that that's so much of what you're about, other people's stories, bringing freedom, encouraging them in so many aspects of your life.
Well, isn't that cool that he just takes, he takes old regrets and turns it into new hope. He takes old shame and turns it into new freedom for somebody else. I mean, that, makes me want to go write a song now.
I'm like right now, I'm like, yes, go do it. We could wrap this up because you need to write that down. I do want to talk about your podcast though too, because I mean, for me, just talking to people and connecting with them, and getting to hear their lives and when God used them. So how did that get started, and what are your plans for your podcast? I loved how your little intro says we're going to be doing like solving unsolved mysteries and
investigating unsolved crimes and discovering or unearthing conspiracy theories and discussing highly divisive political content. I joke about that because it's like, I feel like there's so many podcasts that that people binge on, and then we just get like, it's like, you want to listen about UFOs or Republicans versus Democrats or whatever, and I joke and say, there's other podcasts for that. This is a show about encouragement. I have to start by saying your listeners are forbidden to listen to the Matthew S. podcast until either before or after they've listened to your show, of course. What day does your show release? I want to
on Fridays.
Sure. Okay, all right. So we're not in direct competition.
Oh,
so
good.
That's good. So every Wednesday we release an episode of the Matthew S. podcast, and it's funny. I had like this awesome title for my show, and it dealt with the word story, and my studio is called the Story House, and this and that and the other. And then like I had this name for like a year as I was developing the show. And then my attorneys called me like a few weeks out, and they were like, hey, there's this company in Germany that's got like a similar name, and we don't want you to get sued. And I'm like, Germany is so far away. Like, how are they even going to find out? And so I came up with like 20 other names and just kept like, I was like, I hate that. I don't like that. So finally I was just like, I remembered a wise philosopher. I think it was Socrates that said, keep it simple, stupid. And so I decided, you know what? I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to make it easy for people to find. And so the Matthew S. podcast was born, and it's amazing what quarantine will do. I think this whole thing came out of one, I've had this dream for a long time, but two, my touring career can be incredibly exhausting. I don't think it's 10 kids exhausting like you have dealt with in your life, but did you say 10 kids you have?
We have 10 kids. 6 are still at home.
Goodness.
4 are adults and out of the house.
Yeah, that's just crazy. That's amazing. But my touring career left me pretty exhausted, and so the thought of starting new endeavors, those things just kept on the back burner for a while. And at the beginning of quarantine, I just began to feel like this sense that like the Lord was going to use my voice in a different way. It might not be on stage for now, but there's something different happening. And so I started calling up some different friends, people who have inspired me, influencers and authors and artists and athletes and you name it. And we started having some really interesting conversations, and that's how the podcast was born. So it's been an exciting launch, and I think, it seems like people are enjoying it, and hopefully getting some encouragement, inspiration. And it's a podcast that is steeped in the power of story. And whether it's me interviewing some celebrity and people hearing a part of their story, like I just released a podcast with Max Lucado, who has been like one of my favorite authors. He sold, over 100 million books, and just incredible, right? But what he shares about is his rejection story and how his first manuscript got rejected 14 times, and it was the 15th mailing that he sent it out to. That 15th publisher said we're going to pick it up. And I'm just like, man, those are some awesome stories that we need to hear right now, because there's a whole lot of people feeling like, they've hit a closing door called 2020, and to continue to dream and persevere. Those are some stories that I think are going to really move people.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that. And I think we always compare our weaknesses with other people's strengths. And we always compare our beginnings with someone else's middles or, I mean,
That's so
him.
true.
And I think so many times, and I tell when I speak at conferences and to writers, I'm like, I wrote for over 8 years without getting anything published. Like
Yeah.
and that was back in the day we had to like send them with a self-addressed stamped envelope to get a
Oh,
rejection
yeah.
letter back.
Yeah, of
Like
course.
back in the day. And you're looking at me now, when you see all these books and I'm writing multiple books
Right.
a year but I was a young mom with little babies at my feet and just writing stuff and sending it out.
Yeah.
And don't look at that. Like just get the words down or whatever God is calling you to do.
I
Just
love
do
that.
it.
Yeah, I love that the way you just said that too, of like we're comparing our beginning to somebody else's middle, or and that's so true. And in the music industry it's a lot like that too, where I have to try to remember, like sometimes I'll be griping about something that didn't go right in my music career. And then my wife's always like truth teller for me, but she's like, you know how many artists like wish they
Mhm.
got to where you are? And it's like, but I'm always focused on the artists who've gotten to places that I haven't gotten to. And that can just, all of that does, all of that serves to steal your joy. And what's funny is I talked to my wife, we were on a walk last night, and I was like, I just released this podcast, and I wonder if all I've done is created another lane for me to feel like a disappointment in, like just being totally honest. Like she's like, that is your Enneagram 3 just coming through so heavy right now, because I was just
Yeah.
like, because I released this podcast, and then it's like, what's your next inclination is to go, well, what do people think of it? And it's
Mhm.
like, oh, well, what if they don't like it, or what if it's not ranked, or this, that? It's like all these, my whole life is a lot of times it's based on like chart positioning, and
Yeah.
it's just like, man, that can just like completely steal your joy and wreck your confidence. And why do I set myself, I was like, why do I do this to myself? And she goes, you just need to like, she goes, do you love making this podcast? I was like, yeah, it's so much fun. And she's like,
Mhm.
okay, so do you believe you're supposed to? I'm like, absolutely, I know the Lord has me. She's like, put your head down, go to work, and enjoy the heck out of this season, and it'll work out. And I was like, babe, first of all, don't ever talk to me like that. No, I'm just kidding. I was like, that's such a good word. Like, put your head down, and not in a way like take your eyes off the Lord. She was just like, take your eyes off of the charts and whatever else, it's like, I put this song Truth Be Told on the radio, and it's like, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this radio station hasn't started playing it yet. Maybe they hate me. And it's like, why do we do that? Like,
Yeah.
why does that happen? And how can I just go, why is it so important for me to try to find my worth and my identity everywhere else but the one who is the only one qualified to tell me who I am? And I think that's why I write a lot of songs about identity. Hello, my name is regret.
Mhm.
Hello, my name is defeat. No, hello, my name is child of the one true king. Like, I sing songs that I need, not
Yeah,
that I live up
oh,
to.
I tell that I write that's the books I write. Like, I need the message, and I'm, like, bawling in the middle of it, like,
Yeah,
"Oh, if someone else gets something out of the story, that's great, but this is what God is speaking to
that's
me
it. That is
right
it.
now."
That is
Yeah,
it.
and it's about us in the process with Him, um, and growing in Him as we struggle with these things, and then, the benefit is someone else gets to read it or listen to it, but really it's us on our journey with God in the
That's
process.
that's that's it. And if the podcast is another way that I can share like the continuation of my spiritual journey, and how the Lord's working on me, then I want to make myself available to that. I've seen how the Lord's used my life and my story, and I want to continue to lean into all the different ways he might want to speak through my story. So, speaking of my wife, she's walking in my studio right now and interrupting, and she brought the dog, which could be a major problem for this podcast interview.
I think when I saw you in Kalispell, Montana, you had just gotten married and you were talking about your dog, a dog back
Yeah,
then.
that dog's in heaven now, but
Okay.
but we have a new dog, and it's just as annoying. But we love him, don't we? Say hi. That's my wife,
Hi.
Emily. So
I love that.
I'm talking to Trisha. She's written 80 books and has 10 kids. So if you ever feel overwhelmed, just remember her.
She's like, what am I doing with my life?
That's what she just said. So you just challenged her.
Or I'm just crazy. I don't know. I just take on too much all the way around.
Yeah, you and me both. You know,
oh, I love it.
I feel like I'm not like happy unless I'm like overwhelmed, and then I'm complaining that I'm overwhelmed. It's like, why do I do that to myself? But
absolutely. Well, I think one last thing right before we wrap up, I think so many times, like all the stuff that we're saying, like God has a plan and just put your head down and do the thing, is like the stuff we tell our kids all the time. Like, just do, don't worry about what everyone else is wearing or doing or whatever. I think so many times. And I think one encouragement as we are raising kids and doing the things God calls us to is like they get to see that. Like they get to see, God's hand in your music. They get to see God's hand in my books. And they see us like on our good days and our bad days, but it's all a part of, we always tell our kids, do what God's called you to do, and He has good plans for you. And then they get to see that lived out in us. So whether it's a podcast or a book, or if someone was listening might be called to do a Zoom Bible study, like do the thing that you feel God is asking you to do, because not only you're doing it for yourself, but these kids in your life that are watching and saying, okay, that's what it looks like to step out and follow God.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. And my kids are all of our kids. For those of us who have, or a spouse or anybody who's close to us, they can really serve as a mirror for us if we'll dare to look into it. And I think, these days, that's a huge motivation in my life is, okay, what do I want my daughters to see in me, or to be able to speak about their dad at some point? For starters, it's like, my career will be an epic failure if I have epic success, but my kids say, well, dad was a successful musician or whatever, but we didn't really have a strong relationship with him.
Yeah.
Or man, dad was great at putting on a face when he did a show or a podcast, but he came home and always gave us like the worst of him, like what was left. He put his face on for everybody else, and it's like, man, that's a thing that I think about all the time. I think about like, I want to be somebody. I think about this. This is sort of strange, but this is I sang at a memorial service of a guy that I never even met. I was just doing a favor for my pastor. And so I said, yeah, I'll come and sing a song. And I was standing in the back of the stage, and I'm playing guitar. And this wound up being the kind of memorial service where everybody who wanted to say something could stand up and do it, which is like turned into like the longest memorial service ever. And I'm up on stage just like sweating and going, but I'm standing there and trying to be respectful, and I'm listening one by one to what everybody had to say about this guy who passed away. And at the very end, the guy's lifelong best friend stood up and he said, what the most fitting tribute of our friend here today is that of everybody that stood up to speak about him, there was not one conflicting report. And I just, that has never left me. I've always remembered that moment, and I thought, that's what I want said when I'm leaving this earth. That's what I want my kids to be able to say, is not that dad was perfect, not that dad was, whatever. Like, I want them to be able to say, you know what, like on and off stage, dad was real. He was flawed, but he loved Jesus, and he knew he couldn't keep his own life together. And he always pointed us in the direction of the God who saves us. And, I mean, that's the goal, man. No conflicting reports. And
that sounds like a good song.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. But that's the goal,
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely.
So, I'm trying to, and it's crazy. It's like COVID-19 has made parenting like a whole new, it's like, oh, okay, how do I do this? Like, how do I not let my stress level, just boil over? How do I show my kids that I'm trusting the Lord versus freaking out about the news headlines and so on and so forth? And these days, what I'm really realizing is that I am going to screw up. I am going to miss the chance to lead my family well some days. And I don't, but when I do that, I want to be quick to recognize it, quick to apologize, quick to, ask God for help in leading my family, knowing that I can't do it on my own.
Yeah, and that's where they're gonna grow too, though. How many times a day I'm like, I'm sorry, I raised my voice.
Yeah.
I'm always apologizing to my kids,
Right.
but they need to see that too,
Absolutely.
and they need to see grace and give grace and get grace in return, and that's what it's about. That's what being a part of a family is about, even in the middle of a pandemic.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we all need help. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm asking the Lord for help every single day.
Oh, I love it. Me too. Me too. Well, Matthew, I've just appreciated this so much. I'm excited about your podcast. And all your music has been such an encouragement. Thank you for telling the truth and sharing stories and encouraging other people to share their stories. It makes a huge difference. And like this mama's heart that your song was there for my daughter in
That's
foster
awesome.
care before I even
Yeah.
was. I mean, it does make a difference. So thank you.
Well, that means a lot. I'm so glad we got the chance to talk today, and I want to encourage you just to keep up the great work. You're reaching so many people with so many different ways, and so it's fun to connect with somebody who's trying to use their voice, in a similar in different ways, but in similar ways at the same time, and all for God to get the glory through the stories that we tell. So I'm so glad to be able to connect with your listeners. Hope somebody's encouraged today, and hope we get to speak together again soon.
That would be great, and I know they will be. And we'll have all the ways to connect with you and your podcast and your um, everything on the show notes too. But
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the support, and I promise your listeners won't listen to my podcast until they've listened to yours first.
okay, there we
All
go.
right.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, I have to say that was a super fun interview. I knew Matthew West was cool, but he is so fun to talk to. And I really love his heart and his passion and all he's doing to discover stories, to share truths so that we can find freedom. I remember the first time I shared my heart story, and I mentioned it in the podcast. It was with a group of women at Bible study, and later in front of my church. And really, that was one of the most difficult things I ever did. I remember standing in front of my church about a year later after I first went to that Bible study, and my knees were shaking, my voice was quivering. But as I looked around the room, I saw other women and I saw the tears on their faces, and they came and talked to me afterwards, and they joined a Bible study with me. And I saw those women who, like me, had been bound up with shame and regret and pain, and I saw them find freedom. And so it is my joy, and I know it's Matthew's joy, to help others overcome the shame in their lives. And I love how he said, this is my story and your story and our stories. And I am so excited about just connecting with this podcast and listening to the stories of people that we may think we know, but really we're going to discover more about them and more about their hearts. So go to the show notes, make sure you connect with this podcast, listen to his music. I was just streaming again some Matthew West today. So this is truly a way to support Matthew and all that he's doing to encourage people to share stories. Now, today's Walk It Out verse is Philippians 1:6. And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. And I love this so much that God has good work planned for us, and he will continue his good work. Even when it seems like we have messed things up, we can never mess things up too much for God. I remember that moment when I prayed, God, I have screwed up big time. If you can do anything with my life, please do. And God has done amazing things. So let me pray for you. Well, first of all, Lord, I pray for Matthew. I pray for his family. I pray for his podcast. I just pray that so many people will be encouraged and that their stories will go out and that they will discover that their stories matter and that you have a good plan, good work for their lives. So bless Matthew and all that he does. I pray for each listener. I pray for that person that maybe has a story that he or she has never shared, and that's a burden. I pray that you will help that listener find one person, a safe person that they can share their story with, because I know with sharing those stories, there is freedom. I pray that you will help us to remember that wherever we mess up, that you offer grace and that we can turn to you and depend on you. I pray that you'll be with each of us today. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, I am so encouraged today. I love stories. I love hearing stories. I love sharing stories. And maybe your life has a different story than you had originally planned. I mean, who ever thought that this year would turn out like this? If part of your new story is about homeschooling or virtual learning, or you're thinking about it with your kids, you don't know what the future is going to hold, I just also wanted to share my course, which is homeschoolsuccesscourse.com. Go there, find out more information. There's 13 videos, there's 10 modules and 3 bonus videos. I also include a workbook, a printable workbook, and a homeschool planner, all for you to use. And I share everything that I learned in my 25 years as a homeschooling mom and put my best tips in those videos for you. So I know sometimes it can be overwhelming. Honestly, all you have to do is start the video and I give you so many easy tips to make it as simple as possible. So I hope you will check that out and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you, friends.
Thanks for listening to Walk It Out. Head over to the show notes for this podcast and all past episodes at www.walkitoutpodcast.com. If you love the show, share it with someone you know who can make a radical difference in the world. We love new friends. See you next time.